In 1889, the Victorian scholar William Knight published a life of William Wordsworth. In that life, he drew heavily from Dorothy's journals, which until that point had not been published. Then in 1897, Knight decided to publish a two-volume edition of Dorothy's journals. But what Knight did was cut out details that he found too trivial. His Victorian sense of propriety did not allow him to include all those details we see about headaches and stomach aches and piles and bowel problems. A lot of the details about eating and sleeping, these went away too. In other words, someone like Knight had in his mind a distinction between the important and the trivial. And for him, the important would have been descriptions of the natural world or descriptions of Wordsworth's poetry. But the descriptions of everydayness would not have counted as important. In my opinion, and probably in the opinion of most who read Dorothy's journals now, what makes her journals so magical is precisely that she makes no distinction between the trivial and the non-trivial. She can talk about eating and reading Chaucer and then having a vision in the natural world all within 6 sentences or so. The idea being that for her, there's really no bifurcation between what we could call the sacred and the profane, or what we could call the literary and the non-literary, what we could call the visionary and the ordinary. None of that for her. For her, all of life is important. And the fact that she does not distinguish between the important and the non-important is precisely what gives a tension and a fullness to her prose. It's like we can't have the vision of the tree suddenly turning into a water spirit in the wind and the rain without learning that earlier that day Dorothy prepared a goose. So the everydayness of life at Grasmere, intermingled with these special moments, in my opinion, give Dorothy's prose a very modern feel. There's a sense in her prose of a kind of paratactical, etc. What does that mean? Parataxis is a word we use for items or sentences that are connected together with no conjunctions, or maybe the implied conjunction and. And one might say this is how life feels. I went to the store and I bought some eggs and I drove home, and while driving home I saw a huge dark thundercloud in the distance, and it reminded me of a passage in Moby Dick. And then I got home and I made myself an egg, and then I had a stomach ache, so on and so forth. This sort of the paratactical etc. of what we might call live time is what shows up in Dorothy's prose. Now, if you read someone like Wordsworth, his poetry, it doesn't quite have that feel. Wordsworth clearly, in his mind, does make a distinction between the literary and the non-literary, the important and the non-important. So for him, someone like the leech gatherer in Resolution and Independence becomes important, literary, symbolic, because that leech gatherer allows Wordsworth to buoy his own spirit. The leech gatherer is not intrinsically valuable, he is valuable because of what he symbolizes to the poet. Now, certainly Wordsworth has a lot of lovely little lyric poems, like Poem to the Butterfly, Poem to the Cuckoo, Poem to the Glowworm, where he is just describing these creatures. But there's always a sense that the creature signifies something beyond itself. We don't see this in Dorothy. So I'm going to give you an example of what I'm going to call Dorothy's transcendence of what I would say is a bogus distinction between the trivial and the non-trivial. This is an entry for November 24th, 1801. And just note the movement of her mind throughout her day. She says, Tuesday the 24th, a rainy morning. We all were well except that my head ached a little, and I took my breakfast in bed. I read a little of Chaucer, prepared the goose for dinner, and then we all walked out. I was obliged to return for my fur tippet and spencer, it was so cold. We had intended on going to Easdale, but we shaped our course to Mr. Gell's cottage. It was very windy, and we heard the wind everywhere about us as we went along the lane, but the walls sheltered us. John Green's house looks pretty under Silver Howe. As we were going along, we were stopped at once, at the distance of perhaps 50 yards from our favorite birch tree. It was yielding to the gusty wind with all its tender twigs. The sun shone upon it, and it glanced in the wind like a flying sunshiny flower. It was a tree in shape, with stem and branches, but it was like a spirit of water. The sun went in, and it resumed its purplish appearance, the twigs still yielding to the wind, but not so visibly to us. The other birch trees that were near it looked bright and cheerful, but it was a creature by its own self among them. We could not get into Mr. Gell's grounds, the old tree fallen from its undue exultation above the gate. There's no prose like this. Now, it's important to note that there's almost no punctuation in what I read. It just flows almost like one long sentence, one long, we might use the word even stream of consciousness, where her mind is just moving without pause. And what do we have? She wakes up in the morning, she doesn't feel well. She has breakfast in bed. Oh, she's going to read a little Chaucer. Oh, she's going to prepare a goose for later. Let's go for a walk. She runs out. Oh, I forgot my warm clothing. Got to run back and get it. So she includes not only what some people would call the trivial, preparing a goose, not feeling so well, but also she includes what people might call the accidental. She just records what happened. I had to go back and get my coat because I left it. And then a very sort of everyday description of the landscape. There's a cottage of one of our neighbors. And then suddenly this birch in the wind transforms into this magical creature, a spirit of water. And wow, striking, stunning, gorgeous, special, a spot of time. But then the sun moves, or a cloud moves in front of the sun, rather, and it goes back to its purplish self again. But it remains different among those trees, a special kind of creature. And then Dorothy returns to, here's our neighbor's gate. So this is a passage. It reads almost like a prose poem, where in my mind, if you cut one part of it out, it loses its full power. You have to have the goose to have the spirit of water. You have to have the running back to get the coat to have this creature standing out among all the other birch trees. So in this regard, we might say that for Dorothy, everything is potentially poetic and nothing is poetic. In the context of a passage like this, there's really nothing to separate the eating of a goose from the seeing of the water spirit. They have the same sort of ontological status for her. So in this regard, everything is kind of sacred, important, lyrical, or none of it is. But it feels like, given how Dorothy inhabits her world, that she's able to see the everyday through the coloring of her imagination in such a way that the everyday, the ordinary, becomes extraordinary. So in this regard, she does exactly what Wordsworth says that poets should do in his famous preface to Lyrical Ballads, and that is pay attention to everyday objects, but color them with the imagination in such a way that they become more interesting than they might be otherwise. Well, Dorothy's not doing much coloring here. She's just calling a goose and Chaucer. But there's still a sense in her that if I'm paying attention to it, if I'm attending to it, if it's a part of the rhythm of my everyday life, it is important. It is extraordinary.